Hello, everyone. Today we have Joel Nelson with us. Joel, go ahead and give us your story. When were you diagnosed with diabetes?
I was diagnosed 11 years ago, just about, when I was 18 years of age. So uh, that would have been my first year in college, my freshman year. And um, I guess when I first started noticing symptoms was when um, I was in one of my calculus courses, and even though I was sitting in the front row, um, uh, not too far from the chalkboard, I couldn't make out the exponents or some of the smaller subscripts in the um, uh, board, and it was all kind of fuzzy. And I thought that was unusual, that I had this nearsightedness. Um, and not too long after that, I started noticing uh, other symptoms. Uh, it, there was also just extreme hunger and drastic weight loss, uh, which is odd because normally when you're extremely, uh, uh, I thought, I mean, I'd always been very thin, but I had lost so much weight that I looked probably like I hadn't eaten in a month, and I think I started to piece things together at some point. I mean, I suspected, at least in the back of my mind, that it probably was type 1 because I was so thirsty, and um, I got so dehydrated that I couldn't even eat solid food anymore. So uh, I was in pretty bad shape by the time I actually went into the doctors and got a blood sugar check, which was off the charts. The meters don't even read the blood sugars that I had. So it wasn't until I got into the hospital and my blood sugar was around 1,200, and so I had to be put into critical care, because I'd gone so long with wildly uncontrolled blood sugars, and had to be put on saline and rehydrated, um, uh, and of course, with ketoacidosis, I mean, the survival rate is not that good. So I think I'm fortunate. I don't think if I had held out much longer that I would have survived. But that's basically how things started off for me. And there was I was set up with an endocrinologist after that, and uh, prescribed several insulins. I think it was Lantus and Novolog, if I'm not mistaken, were the ones I started using. And they just prescribed 30 units of Lantus, which turned out to be, when I first started using insulin on my own and injecting it. Of course, I had no idea what I was doing, but it turned out that 30 units was about double what I actually needed. And so I had, when you inject more of the basal insulin than you need, it forces you to eat all the time to compensate for the low blood sugars. So I was having low blood sugars. Blood sugar was crashing throughout the day, and then I would just panic and eat everything in the cupboards, and my blood sugars would go to 500, 700, and it was just kind of this roller coaster. Eventually, I dialed down the dose of the long-acting insulin because I realized it was too much. But that's what they do. I mean, they just kind of gave you an arbitrary number, and it's not very precisely calculated, the insulin. So I had it just kind of continued that way. Erratic. I had constantly erratic blood sugars for, I'd say, around five years or so, and I think I fared better than most diabetics. I mean, I know A1Cs can go as high as 20. I've heard of a lot of patients that have A1Cs of 13 and greater. But I actually stayed for the most part under 7, which, considering, the average diabetic probably isn't too bad. But I think 6.8 was actually my highest A1C. I was just kind of on the standard diets that are prescribed for diabetics, which is, of course, a diet low in saturated fat, low in all fat, really, and very high in carbohydrate, and was injecting one big dose of basal insulin to cover the fasted state and meals, which that's just kind of standard protocol, I think, in endocrinology and diabetes care in general. Is you just take one large dose. The problem with that was that it's constantly driving your blood sugars down, because it's too much insulin at once, and it doesn't match what is needed to cover the fasted state. And so if you're not constantly eating, your blood sugars are falling. And so that's one of the reasons why I had so many severe low blood sugars, and was scaring my family, I'm sure, repeatedly, because I would just become incoherent sometimes, and my blood sugar would go so low I couldn't. I'd have slurred speech and blurred vision, and would feel tired all the time. I would come home from work completely wiped out with basically no energy. It was hard to even make it through the day, actually. And just having roller coaster blood sugars, I mean, it really takes its toll on you, I think, mentally as well. And I'm already sort of an anxiety-prone personality type, but I think that having uncontrolled diabetes just sort of magnifies those things, and depression and things like that. It makes it much worse, I think. So I was in really bad shape, and because I was so unsatisfied with the way I had all the advice I had been given. I thought there must be something better out there, and I did begin to look into alternative low carb diets and stuff, and I read the Atkins Diet Revolution. I read Michael and Mary Dan Eads. I came across Gary Taubes and a lot of those guys that were writing on weight loss, but it wasn't geared towards managing blood sugars as much as it was, advocating low carb for, treating metabolic syndrome. and losing weight and getting in shape. It wasn't a protocol for how to control blood sugars. I don't remember how I came across it, but I think it was one of the fitness podcasts or something where I heard mention of Dr. Richard Bernstein. And so because that book was exactly that, which had been lacking so far. I mean, I hadn't seen any books on the subject of blood sugar control specifically until then. So I was very intrigued by the book and ordered a copy on Amazon. And this was probably about maybe 5-6 years back. And so I read the whole book in less than a week. And, I was very impressed with it because, you can tell this is the sort of book that was written by an engineer because, he was very precise with insulin, matching insulin to your blood sugar needs, and just learning how to calculate how much 1 unit of insulin lowers my blood sugar was enormously helpful, because then I could actually calibrate it to my diet, as opposed to just only going on vague estimations and of course then I learned that carb counting doesn't really work, and I'd already figured that much, but I didn't understand the reason why fully. But all of that was explained in the book. I mean, we're basically trying to match the peak of the absorption of insulin with the peak of the absorption of carbohydrate. But the problem is that requires such precise fine-tuning that it's basically impossible. I mean, because the insulin it doesn't lower your blood sugar at the same rate that the carbohydrate raises it. So I knew that was a problem, and just the problems with estimating these things. I mean, I could never get my blood sugars where I wanted them to be until I started learning about the law of small numbers and about just all the variables that are involved in this. And I think the uncertainty, while it can't be eliminated, can be significantly reduced. And so, I knew it made sense. And as soon as I started putting these ideas into practice, it made an enormous difference, because suddenly, even though I had already gone low carb, I was still having elevated blood sugars and low blood sugars. But once I understood that you could match regular insulin to protein in such a precise manner so as to have your blood sugar stay pretty much the same, from 5 hours out after the meal, they'll still be around 80 or 90. And I eventually figured out how to achieve that using Dr. Bernstein's, not just his diet, which was already roughly similar to what I had been doing, but I think the big thing was learning how to use insulin right. That's what I was basically lacking, because none of the other books I read even touched on that subject. But that book is definitely the most important one for type 1 diabetics, I think. I don't know that I ever would have figured things out without it. I mean, and so I brought my A1C down all the way to 4.5, and it's hovered around 4.5 to 4.7 or thereabout, since I've been doing this. So there's no question that it works. I mean, a lot of the doctors were just amazed. I mean, they saw my A1C and they're like, we've never seen an A1C this low in a type 1. They'd never even heard of it. They think that level of control is impossible. And of course, they always ask about low blood sugars. But, I have had significantly less problem with low blood sugars. I mean, you can't eliminate them entirely, I think, just because, there's still a degree of error that, we can't reduce completely, but it's significantly better than it was on the high carb diet. I think the mistake they make is they assume that the closer you get to a normal blood sugar, because say a blood sugar of 80 is much closer to a hypoglycemic blood sugar than say a blood sugar of 180, they'll reason that, well, it's dangerous to keep diabetics' blood sugars closer to a normal fasting blood sugar because there's much less leeway in terms of the low direction. And that sort of makes some degree of sense, but the problem is that on these high carb diets that they're prescribing, that dietitians are prescribing, that endocrinologists are prescribing for their patients, is that the high, when you're using a lot of insulin to cover carbohydrate, your blood sugars aren't predictable because you're using huge amounts of insulin, which are not going to always act the same from meal to meal. So I could eat the exact same meal and inject the exact same amount of insulin, but if it's a huge amount, then the errors are going to be amplified in the low direction as well as the high direction. And studies show that when diabetics that have a lot of high blood sugars also have a lot of low blood sugars, they tend to go together because, they're both arise from the same problem, which is that we're trying to match the insulin to the carbohydrate, but it's nowhere near precise enough to mimic what the human body naturally does. It's nowhere near precise enough. So once I understood that, it was really empowering because then I could get my blood sugars where I wanted them to be, and I wasn't, having meals and not knowing where I was going to land afterwards. And just the peril of low blood sugars, I think, can be especially problematic. I mean, I had so many bad experiences with that. I mean, one time I was even hospitalized because my blood sugar went so low, and I just completely passed out. And and that's really scary because if you don't know how to use insulin properly and precisely, you can easily get into serious trouble. And there's a reason why a lot of type 1 diabetics, they are, because of, I think the phenomena is most plausibly explained by low blood sugar, is that a lot of them end up dying in their sleep. And that probably is because they're overdosing on insulin, and that's not as as difficult to do as people might think. So just to be free from that, the constant threat of low blood sugars, I think, is one of the things that was I most appreciated about this. I mean, I just don't know if I could. I just don't know how a lot of these type 1s even function. I certainly couldn't manage very well on the high carb, high insulin diet and regimen. And so I'm so grateful for all these great books that have been put out, especially the work of Dr. Bernstein, because I think that, he clearly worked through all the issues and probably knows more about diabetes than anyone alive. And so I'm just glad I was able to find that information. And I hope a lot more type 1s will discover that as well, because, the way that we're treated by doctors, by physicians, by dietitians and so forth, it really should be medical malpractice, because it just seems to me the exact opposite of what we need. It makes absolutely no sense. And getting, type 1 diabetes is a serious disease. I mean, it's, it can easily, I mean, children that are diagnosed in young age typically will have, the average is like 20 years taken off of overall mortality. And so it's comparable to cancer in terms of its effects if it's long-term, if it's not well controlled. And so telling people to eat 300 grams of carbohydrate, which we know makes blood sugar control impossible, it never made the slightest bit of sense. And one of the things I realized reading Gary Taubes is that a lot of the early diabetologists were in favor of low carb, but before the insulin was discovered, it's only after, because they knew that it would keep them alive longer. I mean, diabetics would typically die within, a month or so of a diagnosis before insulin was available. But, they still had sense enough to say, well, the low carb is still the best we can do. But the problem with having insulin is well, it certainly helps us live longer. It by itself, it's not. It certainly doesn't constitute a cure for diabetes. So, and I think that's a mistake, that a lot of people just think that, well, if you have insulin, that's good enough. There's a lot more to it than that. So, and I think what I would say is that for people that are watching this is, I mean, you really have to, go back to, be open to, I think, rethinking a lot of these things, because what we're doing now, I mean, it couldn't possibly be any worse, I think. The dietary advice that we're given now and the outcomes that result from it. So what's the harm in trying something new? If what we're doing now is failing totally and utterly. So that's what I would recommend. And I think, I think the more people that hear about this, the better. And that's why I'm grateful for you and for Tame Type 1 and other websites like it that are redirecting people towards better information that they're not going to discover under standard care.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And hopefully with interviews like this, we can may go even further. I wanted to drill down on something in your story. Um, you mentioned that you were sort of on this roller coaster, even though your A1C was 6.8, your blood sugars were super high and super low all the time, right?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, unless I got extremely lucky, you know, I would almost never have anything even approaching a normal blood sugar after a meal. Um, and part of the problem too is it's not just the carbohydrate, although that causes the worst problems, I think, but because it has the most profound effect on blood sugar. But it's also the not covering protein. I didn't know how to cover protein, and so uh, my blood sugars would gradually creep up to very high levels because I didn't know how to bolus for it. No one ever taught me how to do that, and so um, it's just assumed that you only need to cover carbohydrate, and that's one of the errors the ADA makes, and many of these other um, uh, official agencies that put out these uh, medical guidelines. They don't realize that really all food affects blood sugar, if not directly, indirectly through. Well, at least Bernstein thinks it has something to do with the extension of the gut and hormones that are related to that.
Yes.
Yeah.
The way I see it, there's no such thing as a free food. Even,
No.
I mean, even just pure fat has an effect somehow down the line. It's not like insulin is only used to get sugar in the blood. It's used for a whole bunch of different things. And you need more of it whenever things change. Whenever you eat anything, things are changing. So it's important. Like I had an egg today, just a single boiled egg, and it raised my blood sugar 40 points. You know, it's no such thing as a free food.
No, no, that's true. And uh, every meal you have to inject insulin if you have type 1 diabetes. There may be exceptions to that if you're eating a small meal and you're exercising vigorously, uh, but under normal circumstances, no, you can't get away without bolusing, and you should certainly never have your basal insulin be zero. Um, this is another thing that is a serious error that you know oftentimes I've even endocrinologists that I've known have recommended their patients, if they have an infection or something that slows down their metabolism, to quit taking their basal insulin, and that's extremely dangerous. I mean, it's never a good idea. We might need to reduce it significantly, and certainly when I'm exercising vigorously, um, engaging in a lot of anaerobic exercise, you know, uh, it might make sense to lower it slightly. But you always have to go by blood sugars, and you always have to be careful with this. And there's a certain amount of trial and error with everything with diabetes, with insulin and with dieting. You really have to play around with things a lot. But and I think exercise does make blood sugar control a bit more daunting, but it's with a lot of practice, you can eventually figure out something that works. I mean, I still don't get everything 100% right, when I'm exercising and trying to compensate for it with glucose, because the problem is we really, as type 1s, we really need to use glucose, because we can't turn off our insulin once we inject it. So, like in a normal human, physiological human that's exercising, their insulin is going to turn off when their blood sugars go down during exercise and the glucagon will bring it back up. But that doesn't happen to us because once we've injected that dose of insulin, it's going to keep lowering our blood sugars. So we have to compensate for that. And the best way to do it is just to use glucose. But it's a terrible idea to just eat a lot of food to carb load or something like that. That's going to cause very high blood sugars because the effect of exercise on lowering blood sugar and increasing insulin sensitivity, that isn't going to be offset by eating a huge meal, because say like a huge plate of pasta or something before you run a marathon, it won't work because the timing is off. You're going to get the effect of the carbohydrate too late if you're engaging in any kind of anaerobic exercise, certainly. And I mean, just there's just so many things that people get wrong about this. I mean, a lot of people think. A lot of doctors told me that walking didn't affect blood sugar, but that's certainly false. I mean, it does. I mean, I've had many low blood sugars from walking and forgetting to take my glucose tabs, and my blood sugar will be 40, even though it was 90 when I started walking. So yeah, we're even the most even the slightest bit of exercise can affect our blood sugars in ways that certainly matter. So it's a lot of work. People with this condition, it's like there's no easy path. I mean, you have to work really hard to stay healthy. There's just no way around it, and that's probably not what many people want to hear, but I think it's worth it in the end because, I mean, just to have the mental clarity that comes with having normal blood sugars. I mean, I had uncontrolled blood sugars for so long, I forgot what it felt like to feel normal, So yeah, it's totally worth it in the end because I have so much more mental clarity and energy. My depression cleared up quite a bit, and I don't feel exhausted all the time like I did before, where it's just this constant chronic fatigue. And a lot of the other diabetics I talk to say the same thing. So I think it really does make such a huge difference that it's worth it, even though it's very time consuming. You have to check blood sugars frequently. You have to constantly be injecting insulin and so forth. But yeah, I mean, I've always been the type of person that, I'm just willing to do what's necessary to stay healthy. And I think probably most people are. If it's just that the advice that we've been given is utter nonsense. And so they don't know a better solution. So yeah, there is no cure for type 1 diabetes, but there certainly are solutions for it. That's for sure.
It's one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Bernstein. There is no cure, but there is a solution. And on advice, I want to touch down the fact that all they told you when you diagnosed is to take 30 units of basal, and that's it? No bolus, no carb counting or nothing?
No, they did teach me carb counting, and they did teach me how to bolus with the rapid acting insulins. And so no, but the reason they do that, I think, is because they know the carbohydrate is going to send our blood sugars sky high, and they want to compensate for that a bit with, but it's incredibly unwise to use um, basal insulin to cover meals. But that's what they're doing, essentially. And Bernstein warns against this, that this is problematic for the reasons I explained. Uh, we want our basal insulin to cover the fasted state to prevent, gluconeogenesis. And gluconeogenesis occurs all the time in normal healthy people, but it's carefully regulated, and it only turns on when you need it. But that's not the case with a type 1 who makes no insulin. And so your blood sugars will rise, even if you're not eating anything, if you don't have any basal insulin. So basically, the experiment that you have to do to figure out what the right basal rate is for you, you can estimate it based on your weight, but you basically just fast and skip dinner, inject the dose that you calculated, and if you wake up and you still have the same blood sugar that you did when you went to bed, then you calculated it correctly. But the problem is, they're not even shooting for normal blood sugars to begin with. So they're not even trying to shoot for that. And so I had to learn all of that on my own, of course. But I have to take 2 separate injections. You cannot get, and I've argued with this with my endocrinologist time. They never get to the point that you do need 2 injections, because it won't last. Either it won't last long enough and your blood sugars will go sky high later on, or your blood sugars will go too low if you inject too much at once. The only way around that problem is to spread it out, and taking 2 injections, you get a much more even result, because you're during the night, that's when cortisol is highest. That's when your insulin is going to be lowest, and I actually need the same amount to cover just actually a little bit more at night than I do during the day, but it's roughly split even, once upon arising and once before bed. And my blood sugars are level. They stay at 90. They might be a little higher, around 100, when I wake up. So I know I'm doing it right. And I mean, it's just absurd. I mean, how can you argue I'm doing something wrong if my blood sugars are normal? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So, but I'm not optimistic I'm going to change their minds. But if the results I'm getting aren't going to convince them, then I don't think anything is. But I don't even see endocrinologists anymore. I just stick with family doctors, because they're the only ones that seem to be willing to listen to you. And not that I need their advice necessarily, but I pretty much just go there for routine checkups and A1Cs and for prescriptions, and that's about it. That's pretty much all I need, because I self-manage, and I think a lot of people that are doing what we're doing, we know more than our doctors do about controlling blood sugars, and I think you have to be successful.
Yeah, and it's a crying shame that a lot of us end up having to go to a family doctor rather than an endo, because we should be able to go to endo and get all the advice we need. What that's the whole point of them. And honestly, a lot of diabetics do need an endo that knows everything about diabetes, but it seems like the ones that know the most are the most, what's the way to say this? They know the most, but also at the same time are the most against a better approach because they're so ingrained in the one they do. And it's a real shame, man. Like I want endos to be, I don't want people not to listen to doctors, all right? I want doctors to be people that we can trust with our health, with listening to. That's how it should be. And that's just not how it is right now. It's a crying shame, man.
It certainly is. One of the reasons for that, though, I think, and this is something Dr. Bernstein has pointed out time and time again on his teleseminars, is that, you know, if you follow the standard ADA guidelines for dieting and for insulin and all of that stuff, you're basically immune from lawsuits. I mean, if you have if type 1 patient who injects too much insulin, has a seizure and kills him or herself, then you cannot suffer repercussions from that legally. But if you're following some other advice, even if it's sound, and one of your patients, for whatever reason, tragically injects too much insulin, then you're not. And so I think a lot of people aren't willing to take the risk.
Mm-hmm. It's a liability thing.
Yeah. Yeah. But I really highly admire Bernstein for that. I mean, he's willing to take that risk, which, speaks to the fact that I think that he's confident that what he's doing is the right approach. But, sadly, as you say, many endocrinologists, they won't budge on this, and they seem to be more, they seem to have no interest in blood sugar control, as far as I can tell. I mean, and the dietitians were the least helpful people that I consulted. I mean, they were, they're and all of them, they're supposed to be giving dieting advice, but they themselves are profoundly unhealthy. I mean, all of the dietitians I've met were, 50 pounds at least overweight, and they talk about how much they love carbohydrate and love their desserts and whatnot, and doesn't seem to be working out well for them. But it's really insane, an insane kind of upside down world we live in, where, and I agree with you. I think we have to just keep spreading the word and hope most people figure this out and do everything we can to facilitate that. But it's certainly not going to happen from the top down, I don't think. I think it's just, this is always going to be more of a grassroots type movement, unfortunately. But, I think the fact that, we can save at least some diabetics trouble from ravaging complications and, the dangers of low blood sugars, then I think it's worth it. Even if it's an uphill battle all the way, even if a small number of people find out about it and put it into practice, it's still worthwhile. I mean, I love to hear about people's stories, and it just brings me great encouragement to know that there are other people out there like me uh, who've uh, come to the same conclusions and who have restored their health by um, uh, having this approach. So I'm just so grateful to have lived at a time when we have access to this information and where we're not as reliant on the status quo as we would otherwise be.
Thank God for that, right? Thank God for the internet. It's a double-edged sword in a lot of ways, but at least we can always get the word out to those who want to listen. I wanted to try to sum things up here. You mentioned that your A1C went from 6.8 down to 4.5, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you mentioned that before, when you're on this roller coaster, you had severe depression, your anxiety was magnified, you had no energy, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything else that changed from going high carb to low carb?
Yes. Yeah, I think my dry feet definitely reversed over time. I always had terrible problems with that. Um, uh, that's one thing that comes to mind immediately. And also just the problems with overeating. I mean, you know, that's something I still struggle with to some degree. But I mean, nothing like what was the case, when I was on the high carb um, diet. I mean, the high carb ADA diet. I mean, I would I would have, and part of it was just, I think, low blood sugars that, I would eat an entire jar of peanut butter or an entire carton of ice cream sometimes because you just get this gnawing hunger, and it can be so overwhelming that you just give in and just panic and eat everything in sight. That certainly happened to me uh, repeatedly, and because my uh, insulin injections were not taken at the correct times, and I was so imprecise and sloppy with everything. I didn't, you know, um, that was one of the worst things because then you're getting hit at both ends basically with high blood sugars, and you go from this extreme state of high adrenaline, and your heart's pounding and you're sweating, and uh, to feeling with this almost like hyperphagic hunger, and then on the other side you're a few hours later you feel extremely nauseous because you ate all these carbs, and they send your blood sugar to the moon, and so that's and man, I mean, that just drives you insane after a while. It certainly did me. Um, uh, but yeah, I mean, I don't know if I ever had any other complications though. If I did, they're almost certainly reversed by now. Um, you typically you see complications set in around 10 years of uncontrolled blood sugars. But I guess I was fortunate enough to reverse course before then. I mean, many are not that lucky. I know many who have had lost their eyesight with type 2 or type 1, or had amputations and such. And so it's just not worth it. I mean, it having, you know, being able to eat like everyone else is not, it's not a freedom worth having. I think if that's the price you pay for it. but it's rare that it seems rare that physicians are going to put it that forthrightly to us.
Exactly. Exactly. And you said, did you mention when you found the low carb approach? You said that was about 8 years ago?
Uh, about 6 years ago, I think.
6 years ago.
Um,
Okay.
well, it was I was doing low carb before I actually um, discovered Bernstein, but yeah, it was roughly around then.
Okay. Now, I think it's about time we should wrap this up because we're almost approaching an hour here. Tell us, what is the number one tip you'd give to any diabetics watching this right now? What's one thing you want to tell the world?
Well, um, I would just say that you know, even though it can seem utterly hopeless with this condition, I mean, many people just despair upon hearing of the diagnosis because it is devastating. It was certainly devastating to me because I realized, a lot of the opportunities that I wanted to pursue were probably not realistic anymore. It certainly seems to close doors for many people, but there actually is uh, hope. It's there are resources out there that can help us learn how to control blood sugars, to be reasonably healthy, and certainly more than healthy enough to function throughout the day. And so even though it seems like a very grim prospect, there's just so much out there that I'm blessed to have. Uh, a whole network of people that can support us. I mean, just look at the Type 1 Grit Facebook group and other groups like that are out there that are preaching the same thing, and so it's easy to get kind of lonely because it seems like there aren't that many of us out there, but to have these connections is a huge blessing, I think, and so I think we're in good hands now. Certainly, dealing with type 1 diabetes has never been easier than it is now. That's for sure.
I agree 100%. Well, we'll leave it at that, man. Thank you so much for giving us a story today. I really appreciate having you on. This is how Joel tamed his type 1.